Mom, you're the worst, as both a wife and a woman. Sherry suddenly accused me. I was dumbfounded by these words from my daughter. It was a result of my husband Carlos bad-mouthing me to Sherry. When Sherry started elementary school, the once kind Carlos changed completely. He began to ignore me, and Sherry followed suit. In our home, I was like an invisible thing, only acknowledged for my housework. Being constantly ignored, I lost the ability to make judgments. It was then that an old friend simply asked, "What's wrong?" Those words released the pent-up voice within me. Regaining my sense of self, I decided to fight back against Carlos's treatment. The battle to reclaim my life and my daughter began. My name is Anna Nichols, a 42-year-old housewife. Carlos, my husband, is 43 and a year older than me. We're celebrating our 16th wedding anniversary this year. We have one daughter, Sherry, born the year after we married. She's graduating from middle school this spring. Carlos is a local government employee, the epitome of reliability and seriousness. We first met at an arranged introduction by our bosses. The bosses were present too, adding to the tension. Seeing Carlos sitting there, tense and upright, I thought I could lead a simple but peaceful life with him. After being introduced, I quickly expressed my desire for a relationship, with marriage in mind. Carlos accepted my proposal, agreeing to the marriage. I remember feeling excited about starting a new life, convinced it would be filled with happiness. The period following our engagement was a whirlwind. I wanted to take time to grow closer to Carlos, who was eager to get married soon. Looking back, perhaps we were mismatched from the start. Carlos didn't make much effort to close the distance between us, leaving me perplexed. We only met for wedding preparations, never going on a single date. Yet, when we did meet for these preparations, Carlos was kind, and any dissatisfaction or mistrust I had towards him dissipated. The conversation was always about the wedding or our bosses, but I convinced myself I was satisfied. However, days later, my unsettled feelings for Carlos would resurface, leading to restless days. He's busy with work. This is what it's like to meet through an introduction, I kept telling myself as I approached the wedding day. Married life turned out to be more peaceful than I had imagined. After getting married, I quit my job to become a housewife, guarding the home front. This was Carlos's wish. Becoming a housewife and supporting Carlos in his career left me no room to express my desire to continue working. I loved my job and didn't really want to quit, but I complied with Carlos's wishes, telling myself that marriage involves sacrifices. I told myself that. Our marriage was essentially built on my compromises. There were small grievances and frustrations, but life was generally ordinary and peaceful. Shortly after our marriage, we were blessed with Sherry. Completing the mission of showing our baby to the in-laws was accomplished swiftly. I thought my duty was to raise our daughter to adulthood. I believe Carlos's behavior started to change when Sherry entered elementary school. Sherry grew into a bright and cheerful girl. Both Carlos and I adored her, I think. Wanting to provide her with a good educational environment, we sent her to a private elementary school. It was the so-called entrance exam process, tough but successful in getting her into the school of our choice. Carlos and I both attended her first school open day, and Sherry was thrilled. However, things started to change with Carlos from that day on. He began to find fault with me over trivial things. At first, it was just minor things. For example, he'd criticize my makeup skills or fashion sense. At that time, I thought maybe he was comparing me to other moms, and I reflected on it. After becoming a housewife, and then quickly a mother, I had lost touch with makeup due to the demands of childcare. With Sherry being my first child and my parents living in a different state, relying on them was difficult. Carlos must have been dissatisfied with me. Taking Carlos's comments seriously, I started to pay more attention to my makeup and dressing neatly. I hoped this would mend our relationship. But far from improving, our relationship only worsened. Carlos started telling me not to attend Sherry's school events. He insisted he would attend all her school activities, so there was no need for me, her mother, to be there. But you have to work, right? Isn't it best if I go? I protested. I wanted to see Sherry's growth too. Being told not to attend any school events felt unfair, but Carlos was adamant. It's pitiful for Sherry to have a mother like you at these events. You stood out for all the wrong reasons last time. Your makeup was poor, and your fashion sense is the worst. Don't ever embarrass Sherry like that again. After this, Carlos truly stopped letting me attend any school events. He would take leave from work and go to these events with Sherry, leaving me behind. I always watched them leave with a feeling of loneliness. I heard about Carlos taking up the role of vice president of the Parents Association on the night of the second open day at school. Aren't you too busy with work to take on such a role? I asked, concerned. Carlos glanced at me sideways and sneered, and then let out an exaggerated sigh. A mother can't participate in school events. If I don't do this, Sherry might be at a disadvantage at school. It's all your fault. I can't believe you don't understand that, he said. I was stunned by his words. It was his decision that I couldn't attend the school events. I wanted to tell Carlos to stop blaming me for everything, but I hesitated and eventually couldn't say it. Seeing my silence, Carlos snorted in derision. With this new role, Carlos started visiting the school frequently. He was so dedicated that he would skip work for Parents Association meetings. Sometimes he even stayed out late for drinks. A far cry from the man who used to avoid alcohol and social gatherings. I began to feel anxious and distrusting towards the increasingly changing Carlos. During these days, there was another significant change. It was our daughter, Sherry. She used to be a mommy's girl when she was little, but recently she's become a daddy's girl, clinging to Carlos. Carlos, actively involved in school events, had many shared topics with Sherry, and they always seemed to enjoy their conversation. Mom, are you the worst? Sherry asked me out of the blue while I was folding laundry. Surprised, I replied with a startled, "What?" Dad said so. He said you're the worst as both a wife and a woman, she said. I couldn't believe my elementary school-age daughter would say such a thing. For a moment, everything went dark before my eyes. Sherry's tone was exactly like Carlos when he was persistently blaming me. He must have repeated those words to her many times. Seeing Sherry parroting these memorized words, I was shaking uncontrollably. That night, after Sherry went to bed, I confronted Carlos. I asked him, with a firm tone, if he was filling Sherry's head with bad things about me. Carlos admitted it without hesitation. I'm not saying anything wrong. I want Sherry to grow up taking you as a lesson. Having a bad example of a woman close by is convenient, isn't it? Stop accusing me of lying to Sherry, he said. It wasn't just defiance. I could tell from his attitude that Carlos truly believed what he was saying. The kind Carlos I married was nowhere to be found. What's gotten into you? You weren't like this before. We used to go to the kindergarten open days together. You've changed since Sherry started elementary school, I said, reaching my breaking point and unleashing my pent-up feelings on Carlos. It was a desperate plea to return to our once peaceful and ordinary family life. Carlos smirked at me, saying, "This is normal," which made me shudder and sit down on the spot. From the next day, Carlos started ignoring me. No morning greetings, no goodbye when he left. At the dinner table, he only spoke to Sherry, completely ignoring me as if I didn't exist. He was probably angry about last night. I thought that with time, he would stop ignoring me. It was just a small marital spat, or so I thought lightly. However, Carlos's silent treatment continued. He ate the meals I prepared, and I did all the household chores, and it was as if I was invisible to him. About a month into being ignored by Carlos, I noticed a change in Sherry. She started ignoring me too. This broke my heart. Perhaps Sherry, always wanting to emulate her beloved father, felt like she was sharing a game with him by ignoring me. The play took on a clear maliciousness when Sherry reached the upper grades of elementary school. Carlos and Sherry thoroughly continued to ignore me in the house. This went on for half a year, then a year, and even after Sherry graduated from elementary school. I tried speaking to them several times. They behaved as if they couldn't hear me and laughed at my confusion. It felt like I was living in a bad dream. The first time I confided in an old friend about this was when Sherry was about to graduate from middle school. I had thought this situation was too embarrassing to share with anyone and had been suffering alone. My friend, seeing my constantly downcast demeanor, couldn't bear it anymore and gently asked, "What's wrong?" Something inside me burst at those words. I told my friend everything about my family's current situation, crying and leaving no detail hidden. My story was jumbled and possibly hard to follow in places, but my friend patiently listened until I felt relieved. Surprisingly, after speaking out, my previously chaotic thoughts began to clear up. I realized that being ignored by Sherry had shocked me so much that it had paralyzed my thinking. Could Carlos be having an affair? His attitude changed so suddenly, right? Have you looked into that? My friend asked with concern. Why hadn't I thought of that before? I felt like a light had been turned on in front of me. I had been convincing myself that being ignored was my fault, that I was to blame. Uncovering the truth behind Carlos's change was the first step in breaking this situation. Thank you. Talking to you has really cleared my mind. I feel like I can see what I need to do now, I said, grasping my friend's hand and repeating my thanks. She promised to help in any way she could. We immediately searched for a private detective agency on our mobile phones and decided to have Carlos's behavior investigated. The agency's office was brighter and more welcoming than I had imagined. I briefly explained the current situation and was asked when Carlos's behavior changed. I recalled and answered that it started around the time Sherry began elementary school. The person in charge nodded repeatedly, saying, "I see." The investigation results would take about a week. That week was a nerve-wracking wait for me. But when I finally received the investigation report, I was stunned. Carlos was having an affair. The other woman was a mom friend from Sherry's elementary school. Although I had only met her once, Carlos likely saw her often at Parents Association meetings. Both of them were married, of course. The pictures in the report showed a woman who was indeed attractive and well-groomed. I remembered seeing Carlos talking to her on Sherry's open school day. Carlos must have been charmed by her. As I read on, a sad truth emerged. For the other woman, Carlos was just one of several boyfriends. Carlos was the one smitten, while she seemed to be playing him. Moreover, Sherry was still friends with the woman's daughter. The shock would be enormous to her to learn that her beloved father was involved with her friend's mother. Carlos had been poisoning Sherry against me, probably to prepare her for a potential divorce, making it seem like it can't be helped. And perhaps he was trying to justify his infidelity by painting me as a worthless wife. It was a cunning plan, typical of Carlos. With the investigation report in hand, I met with my friend to plan our next move. We devised a strategy. To Carlos and Sherry, I was like an invisible being in our home, a mere housemaid. Sadly, nothing changed, even on the morning of Sherry's middle school graduation. To them, I was just the invisible housekeeper, I greeted this morning with a sense of relief. Today is your graduation. It came so quickly, didn't it? Congratulations on graduating, I said to Sherry, who was eating breakfast at the table. By this time, I had accepted being ignored, and had stopped actively speaking to Sherry or Carlos. Sherry looked a bit surprised when I suddenly spoke to her. Sherry, you'll be going to boarding high school, so you won't have to see things you don't want to anymore. That's good, isn't it? Carlos interrupted, speaking loudly and deliberately to Sherry. It was already decided that Sherry would attend a boarding school after middle school. Whether it was Carlos's suggestion or Sherry's own desire, I wasn't informed. Before Sherry's middle school graduation, Carlos seemed a bit more animated than usual. Sherry, who seemed like she wanted to say something, closed her mouth again and quietly finished her breakfast. Then, without a word of farewell, she left for the graduation ceremony. Carlos, who was going to attend the ceremony, was dressed in a nice suit. I wondered when he had bought it. His spending had become increasingly reckless, and our living expenses had been reduced. I thought of the serious and earnest Carlos I first met, and felt a tinge of sadness. Take care, I said to Carlos back as he left through the front door. It was probably the last time I would ever say that to him. Ignoring my farewell, Carlos closed the front door roughly. Now it was a race against time. I quickly packed my belongings, which I had secretly been gathering, including items I had used just this morning. I collected only the essentials, discarding anything I hesitated over. I threw all the mementos of my life with Carlos into the trash. Next, I went into Carlos's studio and started pasting the photos from the detective agency, the evidence of his affair, one by one onto his computer. Eventually, his desk was completely covered with these photos. On top of them, I left the signed divorce papers and the business card of the lawyer who would represent me. Finishing everything felt strangely liberating. The moving company arrived, and I had them transport the furniture and items I wanted to keep to my new apartment, which I had already arranged. I wanted to erase every trace of my existence from this house. So I left the house where I had spent my married life. After arriving at my new place, I sent Sherry a message, not hiding anything about what happened or my current feelings. I wanted to tell her that no matter how much she ignored me, I still loved her as my daughter. I didn't mention Carlos's affair, thinking she would find out soon enough. After settling in, evening came. With no reply from Sherry. She had always ignored my messages, and maybe she wouldn't even read this one. If that was the case, I was prepared for it to be our fate. It was past 9 p.m. when my mobile phone alerted me to a call from Carlos. He must have finished the graduation banquet and returned home. I waited for a while before answering, wanting to make Carlos anxious. Despite thinking of not answering at all, I decided to pick up. Just this once. Hello? The graduation ceremony is over, isn't it? Before I could say more, Carlos's yelling came through the phone. At first, I couldn't understand what he was saying, except that he kept insulting me. Can you calm down and talk? I can't understand what you're saying, I said. Listening to his raging, I felt myself become calmer. Whatever he said, it didn't affect me anymore. I just listened to his side of the story. What is this? Divorce papers? And what about those photos? Carlos must be calling from his study, facing the photos pasted on his computer. It was almost funny to imagine. What do you mean? I should be the one asking. Who is that woman? You've been betraying me all this time. And was Sherry's friend's mother? Can you imagine how sad Sherry would be if she found out? I spoke in a voice colder than I believed possible. I had always been reserved with Carlos since our marriage, but that restraint was no longer necessary. I couldn't hold back my words, accusing him of his affair. Carlos, surprised by my unusual attitude, seemed to grasp. It's your fault. You have no charm, so I had no choice but to cheat. I've done nothing wrong. Nothing. Even in this situation, Carlos insisted he wasn't at fault. He kept saying that everything, his affair, his ignoring me at home, was all my fault, and he was blameless. It was clear to me that we couldn't have a reasonable conversation anymore.
Honestly, I never wanted to be introduced to you. I met you reluctantly because our bosses pushed it. I thought I could refuse, but I couldn't because you accepted.
Finally, Carlos began to blame me for everything, going back to when we were first introduced at the beginning of our marriage. It's true that we were both introduced by our bosses, and might not have been enthusiastic at first. But what's the point of bringing that up now, after more than a decade of marriage?
Do you know how inconvenient it was for me when you wanted to date with marriage in mind? What could I have said to our bosses if I refused?
Carlos said, his voice strained. I was more astounded than ever. You should have refused. It was your own marriage. I can't believe I didn't see that you were a man without the courage to refuse. I replied with a heavy sigh. I wished I could go back to the day we were introduced and shatter it. But that's impossible. At least in the end, I wanted to properly conclude this marriage. I felt it was my duty. Anyway, can you fill out the divorce papers and leave them with the lawyer? Of course, I will also be claiming compensation, I said.
Compensation? But you're the one who brought up divorce,
Carlos retorted, latching on to the word compensation. He started ranting that he shouldn't have to pay because he wasn't at fault. I firmly stated, you were the one having an affair. Carlos knew I had evidence of his affair. Without a response, he fell silent. Well, that settles it, I said, and gently ended the call. Afterward, Carlos called several times, but I ignored them all. There was nothing left to discuss with him. Honestly, I didn't even want to hear his voice anymore. It's funny how feelings change. There was a time I longed to hear his voice when he ignored me. Carlos's calls continued the next day. Probably the evidence photos sent to my in-laws had reached them. My mother-in-law called in the morning, apologizing through tears, and my father-in-law promised to speak sternly to Carlos. Eventually, under his parents' persuasion, Carlos signed the divorce papers. Finally, Carlos and I became strangers to each other. Sherry had been staying at her grandparents' during the divorce turmoil. She had found the photos of her father's affair in a study and impulsively left home for her grandparents. She continued to ignore Carlos's attempt to bring her back home. I thought it was good for Carlos to taste a bit of the sadness of being ignored. Although the divorce was finalized, Carlos refused to pay compensation. He insisted in front of the lawyer that the affair was my fault. I submitted my diary as evidence. It contained daily entries of being continuously ignored by Carlos and Sherry. I had been recording the number of times I was ignored each day in this diary. Of course, I also documented all the cruel things Carlos said before he started ignoring me. Seeing this, Carlos finally conceded. I heard there was quite a commotion at his workplace. The husband of the woman Carlos had an affair with apparently stormed into his office. Carlos worked at the City Hall, a public institution. The scandal unfolded in front of the community. Carlos, having completely lost his standing at work, resigned from his job. And so Carlos became unemployed. Sherry and I reconciled, continuing to ignore Carlos. Sherry contacted me in tears after reading my message, admitting she had misunderstood me all this time and acknowledging the depth of Carlos's wrongdoing. In the end, I was granted custody of Sherry. Carlos is now an unemployed, lonely, middle-aged man. His job search isn't going well. He had to put his house up for sale, and now he's retreated to his parents' home. After the divorce, I returned to work. Thanks to a friend, I was able to re-employ as an office worker at a local newspaper. It was a stable job, and I find the work enjoyable after such a long break. Sherry went on to attend a boarding high school, but comes home to me during the long holidays. I feel like I've finally regained my life and my daughter. From now on, I plan to walk this path firmly with Sherry.